David Thoreau held that it requires a direct dispensation from heaven to become a walker, and I believe him. I walk as naturally as I breathe or perform any other bodily function. To exist is to walk, to assert freedom of bodily movement. And this freedom is basic to all other freedoms. There is no progress in my thoughts unless they are geared to a slowly changing landscape. The stimulus comes from external things, the texture of the ground, the weather in the sky, the contours of the hills, the infinite patterns of the trees. Calm follows from the gentle rhythmic movement of the body. Good evening.
This man is a poet. He writes fiction. He writes art criticism. He's something of a historian. He's an editor. He is a publisher. He is politically committed to a particular variety of anarchism, in the case of Herbert Read, syndico-anarchism. He is a kind of version of the 20th century Renaissance man.
L56-203, profile, show.
I'd like to begin by asking you a few biographical questions. I believe that you are a Yorkshireman by birth.
Yes, I was born in the North Riding of Yorkshire, on a remote farm. The North Riding, as you know, is one of the most unchanged parts of England.
Yes.
And the farm itself was very remote from civilization as we know it now.
And did you spend the whole of your childhood in that kind of isolation?
No, my father died when I was 10 years old, and the farm was sold up, and I left then and went to school in the industrial part of Yorkshire.
I think Herbert Read is in many ways a contradictory character. He was born in rural North Yorkshire. He starts off very much as rural conservative. He ends up a radical anarchist. He's someone who lives in a beautiful rural setting for much of his life, and yet he's the champion of modernism. So I think when you try to summarize his life, what you end up with is a series of contradictions. Although one can take his ideas and reapply them and not mention the name, there's something interesting about his life, because he didn't just come to those ideas in an academic sense. He sort of lived them, and I think that's interesting. I think that's something worth following through.
And he says, essentially, I'm a peasant. I despise the whole industrial epoch. The only class in the community for which I feel any real sympathy is the agricultural class, including the genuine remnants of a landed aristocracy. This perhaps explains my early attraction to Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Tolstoy, who were also of the land, aristocrats and peasants. A man cultivating the earth, that is the elementary economic fact. And as a poet, I'm only concerned with elementary facts.
You need to have a sense in the background of his life always that what he felt and wrote about art was somewhere in him connected to what he felt and wrote about the natural world. And I think he felt that in works of art, artists were contributing to the beauty of the world instead of all the other things they were doing to mess it up, which the anarchist did, and did much careful. And the big industrial city was his idea of a nightmare.
Well, yes, you see, I think that break at the age of 10 was, well, you might call it catastrophic. It was very sharp and definite. From this first idyllic 10 years, first of all, into the succeeding 10 years of the industrial scene, then into the war, and so on. And those first 10 years became a very remote poetic image in my mind.
One should never, ever forget that Herbert Read served with distinction in the First World War. And his experiences must have shaped him just in the same way as it shaped the Dadaists. And I think Herbert was deeply affected by that, and that's what made him an anarchist.
You became in many acts and quiet observances a body and a soul entire. I cannot tell what time your life became mine. Perhaps when one summer night we halted on the roadside, in the starlight only, and you sang your sad home songs, dirges which I, standing outside you, coldly condemned. Perhaps one night, descending cold, when rum was mighty acceptable, and my doling gave birth to sensual gratitude. And then our fights. We fought together, compact, unanimous, and I felt the pride of leadership. In many acts and quiet observances you absorbed me,
until one day I stood eminent, and I saw you gathered round me, up-looking, and about you a radiance that seemed to beat with varying glow and to give grace to our unity. But God, I know that I'll stand some day in the loneliest wilderness. Some day my heart will cry for the soul that has been, but that now is scattered with the winds, deceased and devoid. I first came across Read when I was 14. I found a battered old book. I think it was the Oxford Book of Modern Poetry that W.B. Yeats edited. And in it there was a poem called My Company. And I thought, this is a beautiful love poem. I thought it was a bit weird though, you know. I didn't quite understand it, but it seemed to me to be a love poem. And what it was, it turned out to be a poem to his company, the soldiers he was in charge of. Because by the time Read was 26, he was in charge of a battalion. I mean, first the brigadier died, got blown away, then everybody above him kept on getting blown away. And so at 26, he was in charge of all these young boy soldiers, really. Most of them were about 20.
During the war, I used to feel that this comradeship, which had developed among us, would lead to some new social order when peace came. I used to imagine an international party of ex-combatants, united by their common suffering, who would turn against the politicians and the profiteers in every country and create a society based on respect for the individual human being.
I think he came away from the Great War, having survived throughout the 1418 war, decorate, heroic, the DSO, for someone aged 26, that was very unusual, and not being killed. I think he felt he'd been saved for a purpose and that he had a mission, and this mission willy-nilly became modern art, really. So I think, he was like St. Paul or something. He felt he had to go around preaching modern art. And of course, his own, what you might say, his career as a poet or as an essayist was overtaken by this great explosion of the modernist movement in art.
Again, it comes down to the artist's mission is not to be successful in commercial terms, but to be successful in communicating some essential idea about what it is to be human. Now that is a vast, vast philosophical territory.
I think that art should be useful, and I'm with that kind of avant-garde idea that art should have some kind of effect on life practice, on everyday life, rather than making shiny objects that the gallery can sell and make money from. You know, we've got all these kind of problems that the capitalist world has put on us, but how art escapes capitalism when it exists within it is a problem, and it's a problem that Read's dealing with as well.
I was really attracted to the topic of Read by accident, actually. I was set to do my master's thesis on a theater group, and I started reading a book by Read to inform my understanding of anarchism to study this theater group, and then I just loved his voice, the voice that comes through in his writing, and I changed my topic. I just absolutely love the way that he has written about art.
Yes, and where does your writing fit into this? When did you first begin to write?
Oh, I think I first began to be interested in writing at school. I can remember starting in a school magazine, writing for that. Then when I went to the university, I wrote there. I've written from as early as I can remember.
But then he says here, the next paragraph, an orthodox Marxist would no doubt argue that the social pressures which influence taste are merely a reflection of the underlying economic processes. That's so good. That's exactly, you know what I mean? And a Marxist would say that, you know. So he doesn't polemicize against that Marxist. He kind of says, well, here's what that Marxist would say. Now, what do I say? In an obvious sense, this is true enough. But once the economic differentiations have been set up, then the way in which taste develops within each economic group is determined by factors which are not essentially economic. Therefore, they're determined by cultural factors. He goes on to say the taste of the rich and the taste of the poor. You know, so he gets into these really interesting questions about how do you value, how do you judge.
He makes some pretty strong statements, but it's not like they're purely rhetorical. It's not like he doesn't substantiate things. Like, he's a very careful writer and thinker. And he does blend very unusual things together, so he's often throwing out ideas which seem kind of counterintuitive or quite strange, and not least in the way he phrases them.
And he says that freedom is like the freedom of a limb. But what I take him to mean is that freedom is not really to be understood in terms of the absence of limitations. Like, in a kind of cartoonish way, we might think that freedom is the opposite of having limits, you know, and that in an ideal sense, freedom is the ability to fly, to fly free, to be unbounded in any way by anything that defines or constrains you. And it sounds to me that Herbert Read is not talking about freedom in that way at all. This kind of groundedness is something that I really treasure. for all its kind of literary quality of his writing, there's also this beauty in the kind of attachment to the world that it conveys.
We went where you are going, into the rain and the mud. We fought as you will fight, with death and darkness and despair. We gave what you will give, our brains and our blood. We think we gave in vain. The world was not renewed. There was hope in the homestead and anger in the streets, but the old world was restored, and we returned to the dreary field and workshop and the immemorial feud of rich and poor. Our victory was our defeat. Power was retained where power had been misused, and youth was left to sweep away the ashes that the fires had strewn beneath our feet.
To declare for a doctrine so remote as anarchism at this stage of history will be regarded by some critics as a sign of intellectual bankruptcy, by others as a sort of treason, a desertion of the democratic front at the most acute moment of its crisis, by still others as merely poetic nonsense. For myself, it is not only a return to Proudhon, Tolstoy and Kropotkin, who were the predilections of my youth, but a mature realization of their essential rightness. He is at the height of his fame and reputation as an art critic, as the advocate of contemporary art in England, and he comes out for such an untrendy, such an unfashionable doctrine as anarchism. And he holds fast to it.
A song for the Spanish anarchists. The golden lemon is not made, but grows on a green tree. A strong man and his crystal eyes is a man born free. The oxen pass under the yoke, and the blind are led at will, but a man born free has a path of his own, and a house on the hill.
And men are men who till the land, and women are women who weave. 50 men own the lemon grove, and no man is a slave. And that whole idea of anarchism as a strong man and his crystal eyes still retains its importance.
It's reflected in everything he did, everything he wrote, everything he talked to friends about. I mean, one of the really fascinating aspects of working in letters, especially, is the exchange that goes on that you don't see anywhere else.
Okay. Correspondence Kandinsky, The Warringers, Sheila Wingfield, George Woodcock, Margaret Armitage, Victor Passmore, Peter Lanyon, Igor Stravinsky, Graham Sutherland, Antonio Tapie, Ruby Darchot, Michel Tapier, Kathleen Rain, Ben Nicholson, A.R. Orage, Siegfried Sassoon, L.S. Lowry, General Sir Ronald Adam, A.S. Alley, George Orwell, Muriel Spark, Oscar Kokoschka, Henry Miller, Augustus John, Saul Steinberg, Adrian Stokes, John Nash, Paul Nash, Bertrand Russell, Michael Sadler, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Joan Miro, Hans Richter, Stephen Spender, Leo Stein, Dorothy Pound, Ezra Pound, T.E. Lawrence is here. Here's some correspondence between Young and Read. And some of this relates to Herbert Read's book, The Green Child.
some years ago, the famous psychologist C.G. Jung, someone gave him The Green Child, and he read it. And he wrote to me in great excitement, and he'd found all kinds of symbolism there which I hadn't realized was there. That he, with his great knowledge of symbolism in general, had found significance in my story which I myself was not aware of.
But I was impressed by a statement of yours, I think it was again in the Annals of Innocence and Experience, in which you said that for you the aesthetic contained enough to make an attitude towards life, that was sufficient and you didn't need the mystical or the ordinary religious element. I wonder if you would care to expand on that statement.
Well, it may be that I'm making a mysticism out of aesthetics.
Yes.
But my feeling is that these elements of order, of universal order, of which we've spoken, are a sufficient basis, at any rate for ethics and for education. It is really Plato's idea that if we condition ourselves to universal harmony, we become harmonious ourselves.
He smiles a little bit uncomfortably when the idea about mysticism and aesthetics come up. I don't know whether you remember that.
I caught that, yeah.
You caught that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to talk about universal harmony, and they kind of kept talking about that. It's more difficult for them to talk about form, which is another bridge to the mystical. But what I wanted to point out is the where you would put him now is in the the world of romantic anti-capitalism. Right? And at that point, they could have mentioned Blake, but they didn't. They seem to embarrassingly avoided what we were talking about a little bit at the end last night, messianic anarchism. The Green Child is Read's almost saying that there's a part of me that's very deeply mystical, and I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but it's part of my whole baggage.
He could be quite austere. In one of those essays in The Coat of Many Colours, he said, "I've never been a man for conversation because it seems to me it's a waste of effort to not to put it down in writing, as it were." He didn't want to waste his energy on social life, and there are many stories about him in that respect. I mean, one was someone going for a walk with him and saying to Herbert, "What do you think of the work of Miro?" And long silence. And then eventually my father says, "And you, what do you think?" In other words, he'd thought out in his own mind what he thought of Miro, but didn't bother to convey it to the person who had asked the question. I mean, that was very typical of him.
It's very tempting and very easy to suddenly say Read is very English, because in some ways he is. He's looking at the Lakeland poets, or he's going to Yorkshire, and it seems very parochial. But where is his inspiration coming from? I mean, it's coming from people like Schelling, it's coming from Schiller, it's coming from Kierkegaard, it's coming from Voringer, Nietzsche. At a time when these people weren't studied. We're not talking about the 1970s and 80s in university departments where they suddenly discover continental philosophy. We're talking about the 1910s, 20s, 30s and 40s. You were one in a million if you were reading these things in Britain at that time. So yes, he's very English in the way he looks to English traditions, but his underlying philosophy is continental philosophy. That's why he became an English surrealist, because he's tapping into the same sources that they were tapping into.
My father was Reverend Penrose, and he always spoke in very affectionate terms about Herbert, not only about his friendship, but about Herbert's achievements and his work as a scholar. And in a way, they were very good counterparts to each other, which tells us a bit why they both were instrumental in starting the ICA. And in 1936, Roland was organizing the first international Surrealist exhibition. And that was a really key moment. Herbert was really the only art critic that came out and spoke really favorably, very enthusiastically, passionately about the exhibition. Of course, it was very close to his heart. And this was a really exciting moment. It was the first time that Surrealism had come to Britain, and it was Roland and Herbert Read who planted it here.
The Surrealist object. This is the Surrealist object speaking to the British public. It has become necessary for the objects to explain themselves to the people. For convenience, I speak on behalf of other objects. What is a Surrealist object? It is an idea. What a good idea, people say, when something occurs to them, when something appeals to their imagination. How do such ideas come? It is often hard to say. Suddenly or gradually, they are part of our consciousness. Awake or asleep, we become aware of them. Where then do they come from? Some people say, confidently, out of the unconscious. Others will tell you, from the world of dreams. Others, again, speak only of poetry. We need not go into that. It is more important to realize by what act objects come into being, because the nature of the act partly determines the character of the object. But first of all, there is one act without which no object can come to life. This is the act of imagination.
When he talks about abstraction, he's emphasizing process, and he's emphasizing kind of empowerment in the acts of making, and in the engagement with the world, albeit in kind of quite a philosophical way, but in ways that really anticipate the kinds of claims these movements later made and these groups made when they talked about what it was they were doing. They kind of appropriated this kind of avant-garde language as a way to talk about anarchist social practices. So they'd say, instead of doing a protest, that they were creating a work of art, or they were doing a happening or something like this, and they owed something to the kind of space that Read began to open in kind of championing surrealism and anarchism at the same time.
Creative activity that's unpredictable, that wells up from the self, from their individuality, which isn't necessarily to say that the art is cut off from society, just the opposite. The artist is part of society, engaged in a relationship to society, and through the inventive activity of being an artist is contributing to social change. You know, the artist's first point of defense in relation to their own integrity is freedom. And Herbert Read saw the relationship between that essential aspect of being an artist and being an anarchist.
That is what was particularly attractive to us, the leadership. He never told us what to do, Whereas Apollinaire was playing the role of the great man. We had enough of the great man, you see. We had all the rights to be ourselves great men, and we are trying, I mean we, at least as far as I am concerned and certain of my friends, the only thing we did not want all the time is to be the leaders. The French, yes. Breton, yes. They looked for heroes. We were not looking for heroes. The whole philosophy, constructive idea, the main principle of the artist and his work was based on the rule that the work is ahead of the artist, that the artist can be even anonymous.
I've said to hell with culture, and to this consignment we might add another, to hell with the artist. Art as a separate profession is merely a consequence of culture as a separate entity. In a natural society, there will be no precious or privileged beings called artists. There will be only workers.
I mean, it's one of the most important essays ever written in England in the 20th century, in that first half of the 20th century, I think, because it goes against the whole tradition of cultural criticism, and I think eventually has to be brought into the argument about cultural studies, which has, in a way, absorbed so much of what Read was doing. If you look at Morris, if you look at E.P. Thompson, and even Christopher Caldwell in that period, Williams, it was just this ferment, you know, going on. Read, in a way, started in his own way, you know, but then it left him behind.
I think To Hell with Culture is a rejection of capitalism having anything to do with art. For him, it comes from something much less man-made. Culture's man-made for Read, and art isn't.
Sculpture is the most original contribution made by the English to the art of the first half of the century. An unexpected paradox, for we've had no great sculptors since the Middle Ages. But the painting of this half-century, although not so original, has been hardly less vital. But it is conceivable that none of these painters, not even Nicholson and Sutherland, would have found an outlet abroad had not the way been prepared by a sculptor, Henry Moore.
There were two Yorkshire lads who met up early on, and there was an immediate bond established between them. And they stuck to each other, you know, for my father for the rest of his life. You know, he was writing about Moore right up to the end.
For Read, that was a very important point. He'd left the V&A, he'd gone to Edinburgh for a short period of time. Then he'd returned to London, and the first place he stayed was in the studio of Henry Moore. And of course, so his first experience, his real sort of immediate experience of Henry Moore's work was actually living in the studio space, surrounded by these artworks. So there was such a closeness. And that continued throughout the 30s. You know, you've got Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth living nearby. You've got, obviously, Henry Moore's there. Gabo arrives later. And the discussions that were developing around these artists' works, which Herbert Read was very central to, were taking place in the studio.
He believed in democratic institutions, but he also believed in the singleness, if you like, elitism of the artist. You know, what I would call the individuation of the individual artist. That the artist was always probing the process of making art, and the studio as a laboratory or as a research organ, you know, was, I think, the highest institution for him, if that makes any sense. Art has work.
Yeah, and I was sitting there, and Read and Penrose and one or two other friends were talking amongst themselves, and I couldn't quite hear what they were saying, but I realised I was actually in close proximity to Read, who I kind of viewed as a student. I viewed him as a sort of really important figure in my own life, because he was teaching me that art was incredibly important. To be an artist was an incredibly important thing to do. And I could quite categorically say that he almost gave me permission to continue as an artist.
The busy routine kills the flowers that blossom only on the casual path. The gift is sacrificed to gain. The gain is ploughed into the hungry ground. The best of life is sparely spent in contemplation of those laws, illustrious in leaves, in tiny webs spun by the ground spider, in snails' shells and mushroom gills, in acorns and gourds. The design everywhere evident, the purpose still obscure. In a free hour, I walk through the woods with God when the air is calm and the midges hover in the netted sun and stillness. Then deep I sink in reverie. There is rest above the beating heart. The body settles round its axis. Mind simulates the crystal in the cooling rock, the theorem in the beetle's eye. After the day's mutations, finds the silver node of sleep.
Anarchism is an ideology. You know, it's the simple thing that the idea that we can live our lives without being told what to do all the time, and that every fresh problem that comes to us is one that should be faced and dealt with from a non-authoritarian standpoint. You know, and that's what you'll get out of reading this particular essay by Read. But you don't continually have to know more than that. You have to put that into practice.
Well, yes. I think we're probably agreed on that one needs, before we can have any new civilization, any worthwhile culture that is at all comparable to the great cultural periods of the past, we shall have to have a fundamental change in society, in our social structure. I don't pretend to know what that should be, but I think it involves, in the first place, a great deal of decentralization.
When it comes to what he thinks the kind of political effectiveness or message is, it gets weaker then. And that's the frustration for me, is what happens after art rejects, culture rejects the commodification.
Bernard Shaw once said with reference to a proposed national theatre, "It is a simple historical fact that cultural institutions have to be imposed on the masses by rulers or private patrons enlightened enough to know that such institutions are neither luxuries nor mere amusements, but necessities of civilized life." And he says he doesn't agree with this. I believe that cultural institutions imposed on the masses are so much dead weight. To hell with such culture. So he's having this debate about, so how would you put those things in a museum? How would you keep them? And how would you do that differently to the places where he's worked, like this building here? And so it's kind of interesting that he comes to something later, like education through art. Like that seems education institutions seem to be the place where he thinks he can have an impact and make that happen if he can't do it in a museum.
If you get into what education should be about, then you get nearer to being towards the idea of culture being a creative culture and not a destructive one, and not and totally a material one.
The ideas which were influential, the ideas which were important, and the ideas which are anarchist are his ideas on education. He published this large and complicated book, Education Through Art, and here he is saying something which is very important, which I think all anarchists believe, and which was actually influential in Britain. It's the big problem. If you want a new society, a different kind of society, how are you going to bring it about? How are people brought up in a system of rivalry, competition, and hatred to learn to be cooperative and to love one another? Read says they need to learn in school. That's where they need to learn how to cooperate. They need to see different kinds of behaviour.
But I like the way that you asked me about the politics in the art, because on that note, I think there is something that we can actually say, and the moral of the story is that somehow there is some connection between and that what art affords in terms of understanding and breaking down order is what can also be applied to living a life in society, and what government might do through education, through an actual social structure, through education, not through some airy-fairy. How do you do it? Do it through education. Do it through music. Do it through how we bring up children. Those are practical answers that you can actually catch hold of.
I may go the same walk 100 times in a year, but it is never the same experience. The weather is never the same, the light and temperature change, the birds have a different behavior, the cattle have moved into a different field and assumed a different grouping. But most of all, the textures have changed, the textures of the grasses and the hedges, of the trees and the stones. What infinite variety there is in the colour of bark from day to day, from hour to hour, even in one tree, and how the grass changes its texture between the plodding feet.
I met him once in Kirby Moorside, and he seemed to be a very, very kindly, aloof man. Not given to small talk, but very, very pleasant. And I remember he gave me a lift in his car to the railway station after the festival, and we passed as a Kirkdale church, and he got very enthusiastic about the church and how beautiful it was, and very pleased that he was going to be buried there, because most of his father and his family are in that churchyard. And he'd already got his plot waiting for him, you know.
You know, the anarchism may sound a bit airy-fairy and over-optimistic, but it was deep in him, and he was not an establishment man, which was why the knighthood was a shock to his anarchist world.
You know, people always blame my mother for him accepting a knighthood and for being socially aspiring and wanted to live in this huge house, but he wanted to live in that huge house. And I think he felt somehow vindicated that he was knighted for services to literature when previously they'd said, oh, you must stay in the civil service because you might rise to become head of a civil service and get a knighthood, you know. So the fact that he'd done this without, I think he did take some sort of pride in that. I think some of his friends were rather astonished that he set himself up as this country gentleman in Yorkshire.
I don't think it's of any importance whatsoever. I think the fact that you take a bauble from the government is neither here nor there. You know, it's what you've written, it's what you've done that I think retains its importance.
When he died in 1968, the academic scene was about to be hit by criticism, French theory. Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Foucault, and actually he doesn't fit easily into that theory. And I think in that sense he did not fit into post-structuralism and structuralism. And that's one reason why he was overshadowed at the end of the 20th century. But questions of ethics are coming back into art. Questions of what is the relationship between politics and art. And on those questions, I think Herbert Read is going to actually be a very interesting figure to bring back into cultural discussions.
You can see his ideas as having a big influence on the movements that come up in '68. And that becomes amplified like into the 80s and the present. So if you look at Hakim Bey or the kind of North American anarchist tradition of the 80s and things like Journal of Desire Armed, or you look at Colin Ward in the UK and his writing, then those ideas about the importance of art and culture and creativity and essentially a kind of vitalism, which is what Read is getting at when he talks about abstract art and as a radical force. Those ideas are there in Read that then become kind of amplified in this kind of later anarchist thought.
Do you think there is any hope in the tendency today for people to have more and more leisure and to try and use that leisure in some kind of way? People go in for all kinds of do-it-yourself fads and that kind of thing, and many of them actually take up some kind of art or another, or some kind of craft. Do you think that this situation really offers any hope?
Well, it depends what you mean by leisure, because leisure is a very ambiguous word. To most people it just means spare time.
Yes.
Something to fill up with another activity to keep their minds occupied, as it were. But that's not the real meaning of leisure. There again, you see, I would go back to education and say that education must give people a natural use of their leisure, so that they don't feel that they're just left with spare time, but that their whole life is a leisurely activity. And that direction, the forces that move in that direction, will eventually create a different type of society in which art and leisure and all those things which have, in the past have gone towards the creation of a civilization and a culture will have, at any rate, a different kind of opportunity. There will be a new situation which may be more stimulating, more creative.
If we're thinking about kind of what's wrong with the way we do art today, you know, this kind of sense of competitiveness seems important to think about, right? Like, you know, and Herbert Read was talking about a kind of organic culture, you know, where artists didn't see themselves as distinct and, by implication, competitive individuals, but rather as having an organic relationship to the other artists and the broader society in which you're part of. That's a very different model of how we understand competition or differences between artists. So it would be interesting to think, like, what would that kind of organic, like, let's say, non-competitive, organic relationship between artists look like or be like?
Read becomes part of a mix. It is that idea that you're not becoming a Readian, but Read is in there in the mix, because we do have to rediscover it, reinvent it, I suppose, for the time, for now. And so when we're looking at Read, it's not to sort of say, you know, here is the man we must follow, this is the Messiah. It's to say, here are the interesting ideas of Read. They parallel some interesting ideas by Alex Comfort or Max Bleckman or something, you know, other figures. We can add them to these other figures in the way Read himself did. I mean, Read was so eclectic. He wasn't a Freudian. He wasn't a Jungian. He was somebody who hybridized all of these figures and had no qualms about it. He was quite explicit about it. Well, that's the lesson he gives us, that we can do that, because out of that multiplicity, that seeming fragmentation, maybe we end up again with something that's whole. We follow through his methodology rather than his ideology. And I think that's what Read gives us.
The situation today is full of promise, and one might say that the world at large is now alert and waiting for whatever new manifestations may appear from a country that, spiritually speaking, is no longer an island. Good night.
Tonight, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has presented a talk on recent developments in contemporary British art by the eminent English author and critic, Sir Herbert Read.